The wind didn't just blow through the valley of Blackwood Creek. It howled like a wounded animal, carrying the scent of parched earth and old secrets. But on that Tuesday morning, the wind carried something else, the sound of a woman's soul breaking. If you had been standing near the old oak at the edge of the Miller farm, you would have seen her. Clara, the girl with the hair like spun sunlight, was kneeling in the dirt. Her wedding dress, a hand-stitched silk gown that had taken her 6 months to sew, was stained with the red clay of the South. And her hair, that glorious golden mane that people traveled towns over just to admire, lay in jagged, uneven clumps around her feet. She wasn't just crying, she was mourning. And as the steel shears clicked one last time in her brother's hand, she whispered a sentence that would haunt that town for decades. "They've shamed me for loving white." Now you might be wondering, what kind of hate drives a family to scalp their own daughter on her wedding day? And where was the man who promised to protect her? To understand the tragedy of the broken bride and the cowboy who lost his mind, we have to go back to the moment Silas rode into town. Silas wasn't like the other men in Blackwood. He didn't smell of cheap whiskey and resentment. He smelled of leather, cedarwood, and the open trail. He was a man of few words, a drifter who had traded his gun for a lariat, looking for a place where a man's past didn't define his future. When he first saw Clara at the general store, he didn't whistle or throw a crude joke. He simply tipped his hat, his eyes meeting hers with a respect she had never felt before. But Silas had a secret. In a town built on rigid traditions and old-school bloodlines, Silas represented something the town elders hated. He was an outsider who wore white, not just white clothes, but a white soul, a purity of intent that made the corrupt men of Blackwood feel small. And Clara? She was the daughter of the Millers, the most powerful, iron-fisted family in the county. To them, Clara wasn't a person. She was an asset, and she was already promised to someone else. Hold on to that thought, because the moment Silas and Clara's eyes met, a timer started ticking, a timer that was counting down to a shed full of blood and a field full of tears. Their love was a quiet rebellion. They met in the tall grass where the horses grazed, under the silver light of a moon that didn't judge. Silas would tell her about the mountains in the west, places where the air was so thin you could touch the stars. Clara would tell him about her dreams of escaping the suffocating grip of her father, Silas Miller, a man who shared her lover's name but none of his heart. "I'll take you away," Silas promised one night, his calloused hand stroking her cheek. "We'll get married in the little chapel by the spring. I'll wear my best white shirt, and you'll be the brightest thing this world has ever seen." Clara laughed, a sound like bells, in the dark. "They'll call it a scandal. Silas, a Miller girl marrying a common cowboy who loves the color of peace more than the color of gold. Let them call it what they want," he replied. "Love isn't a sin, Clara. It's the only thing that's real." But in Blackwood, real was whatever the men in power decided it was. Clara's brother Elias had been watching. He was a man fueled by a twisted sense of family honor and a deep-seated jealousy of Silas's freedom. To Elias, Silas wasn't just a cowboy. He was a threat to the order of things. When he found out about the secret wedding, he didn't go to the sheriff. He went to the barn. He gathered his cousins, and he waited. The morning of the wedding was eerily still. Silas was waiting at the chapel, his horse saddled, his heart full of a hope he hadn't felt in years. He was wearing that white shirt, crisp and clean, symbolizing a new beginning. He didn't know that 3 miles away, his world was being dismantled. They dragged Clara out of her room, just as she was pinning the final lace. They didn't hit her, not at first. They wanted to destroy her spirit before they touched her skin. Elias held her down, while their father watched from the doorway, his face a mask of cold stone. "You want to be pure?" Elias hissed, the shears glinting in the morning light. "You want to love white? We'll show you what happens to girls who think they're better than their blood." The first snip was the loudest. Clara screamed, but the wind swallowed it. Piece by piece, her identity was stripped away. They didn't just cut her hair. They hacked at it, leaving her scalp bleeding and raw. They threw her into the dirt, her white dress ruined, and told her she was shamed. that no man, especially not a white-hearted drifter, would ever want a shorn, broken bird like her. But here is where the story takes a turn you won't expect. They thought they had broken her. They thought she would crawl into a hole and die of shame. They didn't know that Clara Miller had the heart of a lioness. As she lay there sobbing, "They've shamed me for loving white," a shadow fell over her. It wasn't her brother. It was Silas. He hadn't waited at the chapel. He had felt it, that sudden, cold shiver in his bones that told him something was wrong. He had ridden his horse into the ground to get to her. When he saw her, his bride, bleeding in the dirt, her hair gone, her dress torn, something inside the peaceful cowboy snapped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Silas didn't yell. He didn't curse. He walked over to Clara, took off his white duster, and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. "Silas," she choked out, looking up at him with eyes full of agony. "Look at me. They've ruined me. I'm not your beautiful bride anymore." Silas knelt in the red clay, ignoring the men standing on the porch with their shotguns leveled at his chest. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "Clara, I didn't love your hair. I loved the woman who had the courage to dream of a better life. You aren't shamed." "They are." Then Silas stood up. He turned to the Miller men. His face wasn't angry. It was empty. And an empty man is the most dangerous man alive. "You think you won?" Silas's voice was a low growl that carried across the yard. "You think you can cut a woman's hair and steal her soul? You've just signed your own death warrants. Not by my hand, but by the weight of what you've done." What happened next is the part of the story the locals still whisper about near the fire. Silas didn't draw a gun. He did something much more powerful. He picked Clara up in his arms, walked her to his horse, and mounted up. As the Miller men moved to stop him, Silas looked at the sky and let out a whistle so piercing it made the horses in the barn kick their stalls down. Suddenly, from the woods, dozens of riders appeared. These weren't outlaws. These were the others, the people Blackwood had stepped on for years. The stable hands, the farm workers, the people who Silas had quietly helped during his time in town. They had seen the Miller's cruelty for too long, and today they had seen enough. The Miller men, brave only when facing an unarmed girl, backed down. They watched as the cowboy rode away with his shorn bride. But the tragedy doesn't end with a rescue. The title says the cowboy was broken, and he was. Silas spent the rest of his life tending to Clara, but the image of her in that dirt stayed burned into his mind. He never wore white again. He wore black, a mourning suit for the innocence that was stolen that day. They moved to the mountains, far from the whispers of Blackwood. Clara's hair grew back, but it grew back silver, not from age, but from the shock of that morning. They lived a quiet life, but Silas was never the same. He would sit on the porch for hours, staring at the horizon, his hand resting on his holster, waiting for a ghost that never came. The town of Blackwood eventually crumbled. The Miller farm burned down a year later in a fire that no one bothered to put out. Some say it was justice. Some say it was the weight of the shame they tried to put on Clara. So the next time you see a bride in white, remember Clara. Remember that beauty isn't in the hair or the dress, but in the strength to love, even when the world tries to shave it out of you. And remember the cowboy who, though broken, proved that a man's true strength is measured by how he carries his bride through the mud.